Thanks so much for joining us today at this event. I am delighted to welcome all of our fantastic panelists and all our guests tuning in today. My name is Beverly Eve, and I'm speaking here from the International Organization to Preserve Human Rights, and I'll be hosting the event today. So this event is taking place as part of the 3rd Annual Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. It's taking place this year virtually. As you know, we're all facing various restrictions, but it will be just as fantastic. So firstly, I would like to start by thanking the US Commission of International Religious Freedom, the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, and the International Religious Freedom Roundtable for making this event possible. I'd also like to take the opportunity now to give a special thanks to Sam Brownback, who is Ambassador at Large for the IRF Roundtable, to Gary Bauer, Commissioner of the USCIRF, and to Gail Manchin, Chair of the USCIRF. So as you all know already, the title of today's event is The Attitude of the Islamic Republic of Iran Towards Different Religious Groups. It's a crucial matter of discussion as we witness more and more oppression of religious freedom and the persecution of those who do not identify themselves as part of the ideology which the Islamic Republic of Iran imposes. We'll soon have the opportunity to listen to the expert speakers that we've invited today for the event. But before we do that, I just want to go through a very quick rundown of how the event will proceed. So each panelist will be speaking for around 5 minutes, and following this, we'll have a Q&A session. So the Q&A will be based on questions that have already been submitted ahead of the event. However, if you do have a question that you'd really like to ask, don't worry, you can send it over now by email to info@iophra.org. So info@iophr.org, and we'll do our best to fit all the questions in. So following the Q&A session, we'll hear from the panelists again as they present a 1-minute concluding remarks. And if all goes to plan, hopefully we'll be finishing around 3:15 Eastern Time. So I'm delighted to have a fantastic lineup of guests speaking today. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. So Mr. Ali Reza Nader is a senior fellow for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the FDD, focusing on Iran and US policy in the Middle East. He also researches the Islamic Republic's systematic repression of religious freedom and currently serves on ADL's task force on Middle East minorities. Throughout his career, Ali Reza has advised the US government on Iran. He is regularly called upon to share his analysis with senior policymakers. He's testified before Congress and is often interviewed by the media. He's lectured at the George Washington University and has conducted research and taught analytical courses on US Special Forces and analyst of the Department of the Defense. He obtained his Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from the University of California and his Master of Arts in International Relations from the George Washington University. Ali Reza speaks fluent Persian and is a student of ancient Iranian history and civilization. Mr. Ali Reza Nader, if you could kindly unmute your mic, I now will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for inviting me to speak and for moderating. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see you. I think this is a really great time to discuss the plight of religious minorities in Iran, especially as Iranians all over the world in Iran and outside of Iran observe the 1-year anniversary of the November uprising in Iran and the massacre of Iranian protesters. According to Reuters, the Islamic Republic shot and killed as many as 1,500 Iranians, although that number could be much higher. I've been seeing estimates lately that as many as 8,000 Iranians may have been killed by the Islamic Republic during the protests. And I think the Aban uprising really shows, and the subsequent violent crushing of the uprising really shows the totalitarian and police state nature of the Islamic Republic. This is a regime that cannot tolerate any sort of dissent, and especially organized dissent. And I think that has an important implication for religious minorities in Iran. I believe that the dictatorship of Ayatollah Khamenei is particularly afraid of organized groups that challenge its totalitarian ideology. And it's not just about not being a Shia Muslim in Iran, I think. religious minorities in Iran, especially the more organized groups, really challenge the totalitarian nature of this regime. And these groups don't necessarily have to be large. For example, the Baha'i population in Iran, which is severely persecuted, perhaps numbers a few 100,000 people. There are, however, largest religious minority groups, such as the Sunnis, and also the dervishes in Iran that are better organized. And I think that's one of the major reasons, for example, that we see such a serious crackdown against the dervishes, the Gonabadi dervishes in Iran, because they tend to be more organized, more numerous. They have more of a top-down leadership structure. But even when we've looked at the regime's actions in the past year, we see the regime even go after Shia religious or non-governmental groups. For example, there is a very big charity in Iran called the Imam Ali charity that works independently of the regime, providing services to the Iranian population. And it's not a political or religious group per se. And also it's a Shia group and really doesn't oppose the Islamic Republic explicitly. But because this charity is organized and is organized outside of the system of the Islamic Republic, has been nearly disbanded and faces severe pressure. I believe that today in 2020, that religious minorities are perhaps facing the greatest danger to their existence since the 1979 revolution. Every day we see reports of severe persecution of Christians, for example. Just before I got on the call, there was a report that a Christian Iranian convert had been lashed 80 times for drinking communion wine. So I don't think since the revolution, there's been, and probably the 80s, this much repression against Iran's religious minorities. And in particular Christians, but also dervishes, Baha'i, Sunnis. Because of their small number, I believe Jewish Iranians maintain a lower profile, but they're also persecuted and in danger as well. For example, there was an attack against the tomb of Mordechai last year, and I believe the regime was behind it. And we've seen quite a few arson attacks against other targets, for example, Hindu temples and Christian churches. So what does that mean for today? At FDD, I'm very much focused on US policy toward Iran. And this is a very critical time with the Biden administration coming to power. The US or the new administration has indicated that it wants to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the Iran nuclear agreement. And I think, which I think is on many levels a terrible idea, but when it comes to human rights and the protection of religious minorities, I believe the policy of returning to JCPOA could be particularly terrible for endangered groups in Iran. Human rights in general in Iran, but also endangered groups like religious minorities. During the Obama administration, there was a very active attempt by the US to ignore human rights in Iran. I don't think there was very much of an attempt to pay attention to religious rights whatsoever. I think the current administration has really emphasized religious freedom in Iran, perhaps more than any other US administration since the revolution. But I do think that the incoming administration will not only not prioritize human rights and religious freedom in Iran, but unfortunately, actively try to ignore it or tamp down criticism of the regime's wrongdoings in the interest of joining the nuclear agreement. I don't think necessarily we'll see a repeat of the Obama administration's policies because a lot has changed in Iran and in the Middle East and throughout the world since the JCPOA was signed in 2015. But I do believe that human rights and religious freedom will be sacrificed for the nuclear agreement, unfortunately. And I think this is a really good time for non-governmental groups in American and international civil society to really speak up about the plight of religious minorities in Iran and make the protection of religious freedom, if not a priority, because I don't think that's really realistic with the incoming administration, at least put it on the list of concerns when it comes to Iran. I really don't think it's good for US national security to ignore what's happening in Iran, to ignore the Aban massacre, to ignore the systematic repression of Iranians. And President-elect Biden himself has said that he wants his administration to pursue American principles when it comes to democracy and freedom. And I think this is something everyone should work hard on pressing with administration, that human rights does matter and religious freedom does matter. And it should be part of the possibly renewed negotiations between the United States and the Islamic Republic. Well, thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alireza Nader there. So moving on swiftly to our next panelist, I'm very delighted to welcome Mr. Ibrahim Ahrari Khalaf, who is a journalist, host of Kalama TV, a human rights activist, and a political dissident. He's also a member of the Sunni community. He's been living in exile for around 20 years and hosts the weekly Cheshmandaz program, drawing more than 1.5 million viewers each week. He's very outspoken about the abuses that people of Iran endure by the regime, and he receives regular death threats by members of the occupying regime in Iran. Mr. Ahrari will be delivering his speech in Farsi today, which will be translated live into English. Thank you, Mr. Ahrari, for being here today. I now hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everybody, and my thanks and gratitude for those responsible for making this event happen. Ambassador Brownback, Yusuf, and members of International Organization to Preserve Human Rights. And thank you for making this, giving me this opportunity to represent the Sunni community of Iran in this program. In the previous conference, I talked about 42 years of systematic oppression of the Sunni communities by the regime in Iran, which consists of at least 25% of the population in Iran. In this meeting, I would like to bring about the following points. Please bear in mind that all the facts, numbers, and statistics prior to the revolution about the Sunni population in Iran have been totally eradicated, and after the revolution, the same thing. There are no credible statistics issued by the regime about the Sunni population in Iran. First, I'm going to talk about the Sunni population in Greater Tehran, city of Karaj, and the surrounding towns, which is about 2 million. And then I'll move on to the statistics about each state and different regions in Iran issued by various organizations within Iran, government agencies in Iran, where Sunni population is more than 90% of the local population. In the provinces of Sistan, Baluchistan, Kurdistan, Golestan, Hormozgan, Kermanshah, and East Azerbaijan, there are 11.3 million Sunnis, which if you even assume that there is a 10% error margin, at 90% the population would be 9.3 million almost. And the following are states or regions that the Sunni population is at least or about 50% of the local population. Southern Khorasan, Northern Khorasan, Khorasan-e-Razavi, Fars, Khuzestan, and Bushehr, with a total of 18.8 million population, and 50% of which would be 9 million. So there are about 9.3, 9.4 million Sunnis within these regions alone. And the following are states and regions that have at least 20% or about 20% Sunni population. Gilan, Lorestan, Eastern Azerbaijan, Ardabil, Kerman, and they have a total of 12.6 million people in population, and 20% of which would be 2.5 million. And based on numbers that I just quoted, even if you take 20% error margin, the Sunni population would be about 24 million, 80% of which with 20% margin would be at least 20 million as of 2016. So there are at least 20 million Sunnis living in Iran as of 2016. This systematic destruction of Sunni mosques over the past 42 years, the most important of which was the historical mosque in Mashhad, which was destroyed and converted to a park on the anniversary of the revolution in 1983. And then the murder of the people in the mosque while they were praying in Makki Mosque in Zahedan, and the mosque of Imam Abu Hanifa Seminary School in Zabul are among some of the examples and statistics. And Sunnis, even though there are at least 1 million Sunnis in the capital city of Tehran, they do not have a single mosque to pray in Tehran, and they haven't been allowed to build one. One of the rare few capitals where Sunnis do not have a mosque or place to pray in the world. And we are denied the right to have any kind of media, social media, TV, print media. And this prejudice and this oppressive policies are in the constitution of the regime, which denies Sunnis positions, high-ranking positions in the government and within the country. And even the lower-ranking positions are denied to Sunnis. And I'm going to point out a few of the assassinations and murders within Iran and outside of Iran of the Sunni activists and religious leaders. The picture behind him are on the background are some of the Sunni leaders that have been murdered and assassinated over the years. In 1982, October 1982, Bahman Shakuri, who was the chair of the Sunni community in Iran, was executed. In 1989, Allame Kak Nasser Sobhani, who was one of the high-ranking members of the Shams Commission and the head of the seminary school in Pave, was also executed. In 1989, Maulavi Abdul Haq Jafari, religious leader in Torbat Jam, was also executed. In 1991, Maulavi Abdul Wahab Sadiqi Khafi, one of the religious leaders in Khorasan, also was executed. In 1991, Dr. Ali Muzaffarian, a physician and also the imam of the mosque in Shiraz, was executed. In 1992, Allama Ahmad Muftizadeh, one of the founders of the Commission for Sunni communities in Iran, the Shams Commission, after many years of enduring tortures in prison, was suspiciously murdered. Habibullah Hossein-Pur in 1998 was disappeared. He was arrested and disappeared, and nobody has heard or seen him since. In 1998, Shamsuddin Kiani, he was a seminary student in Zahedan, was murdered, and his murdered body was burnt. In 1994, Sheikh Muhammad Saleh Ziai, the religious leader in Bandar Abbas and the southern region of Iran, was summoned for interrogation, and during interrogation, he was murdered. And he was cut into pieces, like the priest, Dibaj. They cut his body after they murdered him into pieces. In 1994, Maulavi Abdul Aziz Yari, another religious leader in Birjand, was assassinated. In 1996, Allama Muhammad Rabi'i, another religious leader in Kermanshah, was assassinated. 1995, Dr. Abdulaziz Kazemi, a university professor in Zahedan, was also assassinated. In 1994, Mr. Hossein Barazande, who was an engineer and also a teacher of Islamic studies and Quran near Bakilova prison, was murdered. In 1993, Dr. Sheikh Ahmad Sayyad, a renowned scholar, internationally known, and one of the founders of the religious school Darul Saneh, Zarabad, in Chabahar, was assassinated. In 1995, Farooq Farsad, who was in internal exile in Ardabil, was also assassinated. In 1995, Maulavi Abdul Malik Mullazadeh, who was one of the prominent leaders of Sunnis in Baluch Sunnis, and one of the founders of Shams Commission, was assassinated in Karachi, Pakistan. And the same day, the same year, in 1995, Maulavi Abdul Nasser Jamshid Zahi, another leader of Baluchi Sunnis, was also assassinated in Karachi. In 1997, Maulavi Nuruddin Gharibi, one of the active religious leaders of in Khorasan, was assassinated in Tajikistan. In 2001, Maulavi Musa Karampur, the Imam at Sheikh Faiz Mosque in Mashhad, was murdered in a bombing in Afghanistan. And in 2001, Maulana Ibrahim Damani, another prominent Baluch Sunni leader, was murdered after he was released from prison. And in 2005, Dr. Mortaza Radmer, after converting to Sunni Islam, was murdered in Pakistan. And in 2006, Maulavi Nematullah Tawlidi, in a staged car accident, was murdered. And in 2006, Maulana Muhammad Umar Sarbazi, who was one of the spiritual leaders of a Sufi Baluch group, was poisoned and murdered by IRGC. Okay. And in 2008, Maulavi Abdul Qudus Mullazahi, the Imam and the leader of the seminary school in Iran Shahr, was executed in the prison. And in 2008, Maulavi Muhammad Yusuf Sohrabi was also executed in Zahedan prison. In 2008, Sheikh Ali Behbari, another leader of the Sunni groups, religious groups, was assassinated in Balochistan. And then in 2008, Maulavi Salahuddin Sayyidi was executed in Zahedan prison. Then in 2013, Maulavi Salman Miyawi in Chabahar, after an attack by an armed group, was murdered in Khorramabad prison. And many, many more. And then in 2019, Maulavi Ibrahim Safizadeh, who was one of the leaders of the Sunni population in Khorasan and active in social media, was assassinated in Herat, Afghanistan. And the arrest and imprisonment of Abdurrahman Kuhi and many, many more in 2019. So in closing, it's just the systematic continuation of the same things, insulting the beliefs of the Sunni population in Iran, and the oppression continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahrari, and thank you for sharing that with us all. So we'll move on to the next speaker now, Mr. Mansour Borji. Welcome. Mr. Borji is an Iranian-born human rights activist, director and advocate for persecuted Iranian Christians with his organization called Article 18, based in the UK. Mr. Borji is a regular guest on the new season of Sat7's Persian-speaking talk show Insiders. The program tackles common misunderstandings such as the misconceptions that changing your religion is against the law in Iran. In fact, since Iran has signed Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Iranians legally have the right to choose and practice their own religion. Mr. Borji often reminds viewers that Christians should lead the way in showing respect and acceptance to those with other beliefs and promoting the rights of all. Mr. Borji, if you would kindly unmute, I'm now happy to hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel for this important discussion. As a representative of the Iranian Christian community, perhaps I should begin by responding to the frequent claims of the Iranian regime and the supporters that Christians, as one of Iran's 3 recognized religious minorities, enjoy equal rights. The first thing to say is that this is not even true for recognized Christians of Armenian or Assyrian descent. Though they are afforded some measures of freedom to conduct services, provided they do only do so in their ethnic minority language. For most Christians, these rights or these freedoms are withdrawn. So it's only provided for these traditional Armenian and Assyrian communities if they do so in their ethnic minority language and don't allow converts to join them. And bear in mind that sharing one's faith with others is both an essential pillar of Christianity, as it is in Islam, and that the freedom to do so is enshrined within the two of the international covenants that Iran has signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. So by putting aside for 1 minute the recognized Christians are not afforded this right, and those who fail to comply, such as the Iranian Assyrian pastor Victor Bet Tamraz, who was on the news quite a while ago, faced persecution, such as a 10-year prison sentence given to Pastor Victor Bet Tamraz that forced him out of the country back in August. But even those members of the Iranian recognized minorities who choose not to evangelize do not enjoy the same rights as their Muslim compatriots, whether it's inheritance, where the one Muslim relative is entitled to inherit everything at the expense of his non-Muslim family member, or in employment, where non-Muslims are prohibited from many government jobs or a position in the army despite being forced to partake in military service. Or testimony in court, for that matter, where the testimony of non-Muslims cannot be accepted against that of a Muslim. I could go on, but I think you get the point. That is, in no way can it be legitimately claimed that non-Muslims enjoy equal rights, whether they are recognized or unrecognized. I know many of my Muslim friends and compatriots would say it probably applies to many of us as well if we do not share the same interpretation of Islam as that of the ruling clergies in Iran. So while there are many challenges and provisions for the recognized minorities, including Christians, it is unrecognized minorities like Baha'is and the Christian converts who suffer most. Currently, Article 18 is aware of at least 17 Christian prisoners of conscience, all of whom are converted from Islam to Christianity, incarcerated in Tehran's Evin prison, while two others, having already spent years in prison, are now living in exile hundreds of miles away from their home and their families. We recently reported on one of those exiled Christians, Johan Omidi. I have his picture on my screen, but I don't know how to share it with you here. You could find all those reports on our Article 18 website. Johan, after 1 month being in exile, was sentenced for sharing a cup of wine as a part of the communion service. It's a religious ritual practiced by Christians around the world, but he was given 80 lashes for drinking communion wine as a part of the religious ceremony. And we're so grateful that the State Department condemned this, and I wish that many of the countries around the world, including Europe, would follow that example. This sort of treatment of Christians for practicing their religious rights should not be punishable so violently. Then just last Sunday, we're talking about just 6 days ago, or just a few days ago, Johan's friend, Saheb Fadai, who is one of the Christians still in Evin prison, serving a 6-year prison sentence, was given the same punishment. He was just summoned to his the court near Evin prison, where he was told that the sentence must be carried out right then and there. Now, perhaps it is helpful to explain here that while it is illegal for Muslims to drink alcohol in Iran, exemptions are made for recognized minorities, but converts are not recognized. And therefore, this act of worship, that is taking a sip of wine as a part of this religious ceremony, was considered a crime worthy of flogging. Alongside the freedom of to share one's faith, another of the freedoms enshrined in Article 18 of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and civil and political rights is the freedom to change one's religion. But in Iran, such freedoms, regardless of any treaties Iran may have signed, are not afforded. And the reality is that any Iranian who chooses to become a Christian can, like the at least 15 that are now, or 16 that are now in prison, expect to be arrested and charged with acting against national security. Why? Because the only place of worship available for these new Christians are the underground house churches, which only exist because converts are strictly prohibited by the state from attending the recognized Armenian and Assyrian-speaking churches. In other words, as one of the many converts who has now fled Iran, Kavian Fallah Mohammadi, whose witness statement was just published today on our website, he was given 10-year prison sentence alongside Pastor Victor Betamraz for being a part of his house church. He said, and I quote here, "The only place where Persian-speaking Christians can gather is homes. So inevitably, we do gather together like this. But of course, it wouldn't be our first choice, and it isn't safe." One other case I want to quickly draw your attention to is that of Sam Khosravi and his wife Maryam Falahi and their adopted 2-year-old daughter Lydia, who is said to be taken away from them because they are Christians. And Lydia, as an adopted child, is considered by the state to be Muslim. 120 lawyers and activists have kindly written to the head of the Iranian judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, asking him to overturn his verdict. And I'd like to read just a short quote from Maryam, mother, who says, "We have looked after our daughter for nearly 2 years, and even the judge has said an intense emotional ties has been established between us and Lydia, and she faces an uncertain future because of the health problem she has, this 2-year-old child. But still, they insist on separating us from one another. This will have an immense emotional toll on all of us, and most importantly, on Lydia." This is a very heartbreaking situation and just illustrates what goes on, usually unreported on Iranian Christian community. I think I'm out of time right now, but I hope that this was enough to at least introduce you to some of the many challenges facing Christians in Iran, both recognized and unrecognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Borji. Appreciate that. So moving on to our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Mr. Afshin Sajidi. Afshin Sajidi was born in Tehran and received his diploma in mathematics and physics in 1981. The closure of universities in Iran after the 1979 revolution delayed his entry to university, but in 1993, Mr. Sajidi graduated in the field of diplomatic and political relations from the University of International Relations in Tehran. A few years later, in 2001, he enrolled in the University of Leuven, Belgium, and received his master's degree in European politics and policies. Since then, he has worked with IOPHR as a political and international legal advisor. Mr. Sajidi, I hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bev. Hello, everybody. In order to be more concrete and can provide more information, I have made already some notes, which I'm going to read it, and I would like to offer my apologies if it can be boring for you, but I hope that the information would be interesting to you. Today, I would like to examine and analyze the issue of Iran's violent treatment of religious groups from another angle. In fact, as it will be shown, this issue should be seen and evaluated as a global security concern. In order, the policy of the Islamic Republic towards the religious minorities inside of Iran can be better understood, this policy should be examined in the context of long-term global strategy of this regime. In other words, the regime's behavior towards the different religious groups and minorities in Iran is not driven from a religious characteristic nature, as expected, but from a pure political calculation. As we know, Iran is an ancient country with a rich history of several thousand years. It is very natural and expected that in different parts of this great and ancient country, many religious groups have emerged during these thousands of years. Currently, there are several religious groups in different parts of Iran, like Jews, Zoroastrian, Baha'i, Sunni, Shiite, Christian, and many others, among which the ruling system is only a fundamentalist version of one of them. Aside with them, there are also some Gnostic and Sufis which consist together with other religious group, cross-cleavage structure. Looking at the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran's treatment of religious groups, it is clear that the Iranian regime has treated Muslims and non-Muslims alike equally harshly. Therefore, it can be understood that the ideology of Islam has not played a role in determining the type of policy of Iranian regime towards the religious groups in Iran. It is, in fact, the position of these groups within society that determines the treatment of these groups by Iran's ruling regime. In this concern, at first glance, the policy of the ruling regime in Iran towards religious groups may seem to be a dual policy. For example, while the Sunni citizens in Iran are under intense security pressure to engage in religious activities, in the capital of Tehran, there is not even a single mosque for more than 2 million Sunnis. And Sunni citizens do not even have the right to hold congregational prayers in their own homes. Meanwhile, the regime is spending large sums of money establishing mosques, religious schools, and hospitals among the Islamic communities outside Iran, across the world, in which the Sunnis are in majority. Why should it be like this? Why it should be like this? Why the Iranian Sunni citizen cannot benefit from the generosity of the Islamic Republic to their counterparts in other countries? The answer must be sought in the position of religious groups. In fact, the Iranian regime is trying to establish a kind of hegemony among the Muslims in other countries by spending large sums of money in order to use them for its own illegitimate purposes in those countries, while the standard of living for Sunni citizens in some provinces of Iran is the lowest in the world. It is clear that Iran's goal of generously spending large sums of money, as well as other facilities in other countries, is preparing the religious groups for those countries to implement Iran's goals. On the other hand, the Iranian authorities' harsh treatment of religious groups is due to the fact that they want to create a uniform society, like a military barracks in which there is no trace of tolerance and friendship. Recently, it has been observed that some Iranian officials are talking about global management. Those who are unable to even provide sanitary sewage systems for their citizens want to run the world. It can be understood that the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran are preparing the country to engage in a long and erosive war, and in such situation, creating a closed society that is shut off from the rest of the world. As mentioned, the Shiite clerics formed an authoritarian Shiite government in Iran in violation of the principles of tolerance and peaceful coexistence that have prevailed for thousands of years between different ethnic and religious groups in Iran. But it should not be assumed that this authoritarian Shiite regime treats Shiites better than the other religious groups. As a clear example, we can mention the behavior of the Iranian regime with the dervishes of the Ni'matullahi Sufi Ghanabadi, who prompts love and unity. This tolerant view places them in a contrary position to the hostile and vindictive policies of the Islamic State. This is why they were always under the most severe pressure from the Iranian security services during past decades. So the Ghanabadi dervishes, with about 8 million population, have always been under widespread crackdown by the regime. Their places of worship have been destroyed dozens of times, and thousands of them have been arrested for no apparent reason and sentenced to long prison terms. The late Dr. Nur Ali Tabandeh, the spiritual leader of the Ghanabadi dervishes, also known as Gandhi of Iran, was a professor in law, graduated from the Sorbonne, a former high-ranked judge, and one of the co-founder of the first human rights organization in Iran. During his 23 years of spiritual leadership, taught the dervishes the principles of tolerance and love for all the world, and warned them against any belligerence. Because of the lack of support of the million of peace-loving dervishes who make up at least 10% of the Iranian population, any war that the Iranian regime wants to start with the rest of the world would not be supported by the Sufis. And from this point of view, the efforts of the spiritual leader of Ghanabadi dervishes, Dr. Nur Ali Tabandeh, has had a decisive impact on maintaining world peace and security. It is for the reason that Dr. Tabandeh was placed under house arrest for about 2 years, and his communication with the outside world was completely cut off. They fired all the staff of Dr. Tabandeh's house and replaced them with the security forces, and then appointed several agents who worked for the regime to take over the management of the Ghanabadi dervishes and try to target them for governmental purposes. In other words, they tried for 2 years to establish a kind of state-run Sufism in Iran. But at the age of 92, Dr. Tabandeh heroically resisted their demands until the medical team of security forces finally assassinated him. The Iranian authorities treat other religious groups in the same way. For example, a Zoroastrian leader was first abducted and then brutally murdered. And the police closed his case by saying that his killer has committed suicide. Also, in the recent years, a large number of Christian priesters, especially those who converted from the Islam to Christianity, have been brutally murdered. Although conversion religion change is still a crime in some parts of the world, Iran is the only country in the world where conversion is punishable by death. Many Sunni leaders, especially in Sistan and Balochistan province, have been also abducted and later killed at the same way. And this is true for the other religious groups like Baha'i. In fact, the Iranian leaders are concerned about the influence of the religious leaders among their followers and feel very threatened by them. To start a great war, they need obedient citizens, so that they do not hesitate to carry out the belligerent orders of the central government, which contracts the influence of the leaders of the religious groups that usually call their followers for peace, tranquility, and friendship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sajidi. Really appreciate it. So moving on to our next speaker now, I'm delighted to welcome Sharon Nazarian. Dr. Sharon Nazarian is an Iranian-born American social activist, academic, and philanthropist. Prior to joining the ADL in 2017, Dr. Nazarian was active in 3 worlds: academia, philanthropy, and foreign policy. She is the president of the YNS Nazarene Family Foundation, with a regional office in Israel named the IMA Foundation. She is also the founder of the YNS Nazarene Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and chair of its advisory board. Sharon taught as an adjunct professor at UCLA in the Department of Political Science, is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and sits on a myriad of foreign policy boards. She is currently the Senior Vice President of the Anti-Defamation League for International Affairs, taking the responsibility of fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred around the globe, including overseeing ADL's Israel office. I'm now delighted to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be with all of you here today. I will go ahead and share screen so we can discuss the plight of the Jews of Iran and the anti-Semitism that really emanates from this regime. As mentioned, ADL is an organization that in its 107 years has fought against anti-Semitism and tried to secure just and fair treatment for all. Our team, the International Affairs team, really focuses on doing the same thing around the world, literally. 2 years ago, in response to growing climate of hostility towards minorities across the Middle East, in my position at ADL, I launched the ADL Task Force on Middle East minorities with a mission of educating, advocating, and elevating the issues of challenging these important and all too often overlooked communities across the region, including religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, and other groups who face governmental and societal repression and discrimination. The task force consists of a stellar group of scholars, journalists, and advocates, including my co-panelist, Ali Reza Nader, who you heard from at the outset, who are experts in what is happening in these minority communities, and through their expertise have tremendous insights into what the international community and all of us can do to help them. ADL's focus on the Middle East, where illiberal ideologies and governments continue to persecute and discriminate against minorities, is crucial. High on that list is, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. As an Iranian-born Jew who was forced to flee Iran during the revolution, I'm intimately familiar with the hateful policies and biases against the minorities which permeate through Iranian society. Of course, ADL has long focused on Iran's destructive policies across the region, its financial and material support for terrorist organizations and terrorist activities, its bolstering of extremist regimes, its unceasing threatening posture toward the State of Israel. At ADL, we agree with Secretary of State Pompeo's message this February that in addition to the fact that Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran also is the world's largest state sponsor of anti-Semitism anywhere in the world today. For example, many of you may be familiar with this atrocious drawing that Iran's supreme leader released in English, Arabic, and Persian for May of 2020, showing terrorist groups overrunning Jerusalem and using the Nazi slogan of the final solution. During the current corona pandemic, ADL has reported that while battling this virus, the regime has once again become the #1 state sponsor of scapegoating Jews, baselessly blaming world Jewry for the disease's spread. We documented in an article this spring for Iran Wire the broad array of ways in which Iran's supreme leader, his propaganda outlets, and other Iranian officials spread lies scapegoating Jews for the global health crisis. Additionally, when we learned that Iran's health ministry, in the middle of the pandemic, was sponsoring a cartoon contest on the global health pandemic, and that they had partnered with the same fanatical artist group for this contest that had previously put on Holocaust denial cartoon contests for the Iranian government in 2006 and 2010, ADL spent hours digging through the new contest submissions to identify and expose such submissions. We exposed it through the social media platforms such as Twitter, and within several days, it was broadcast around the world by Israel's foreign ministry and others, which used our selections in particular to expose Iran's anti-Semitism with a multimedia video. Furthermore, we have confirmed that the Iranian government's third cartoon contest focused on Holocaust denial and related anti-Semitic incitement is now underway, framed around Holocaust issues, free speech, and Palestinian issues. We're monitoring closely for when more information is publicly accessible in the days ahead. Iran's proxies throughout the region continue as well to spread anti-Semitism in line with its hateful propaganda. For example, we issued a public ADL report this past June looking at anti-Semitism, hate, and terrorism in Hezbollah school textbooks in Lebanon. For example, in one of the textbooks used at a Hezbollah-sponsored school, we found this lesson in which a grandfather tells his grandson Ahmad, "Let us take the lesson. The Zionists are the enemies of humanity in the past, present, and future because of their characteristics: deceit, treason, treachery, and breaking pacts." We have since briefed officials at the US Treasury Department and US State Department, as well as senior officials at the White House and the USAID about our findings, in the hopes that the US will impose sanctions to freeze those Hezbollah educational front groups out from the international economy. We also hope that ADL's findings will help Washington persuade allies in Latin America and Europe to take a more concerted effort against Hezbollah and other terrorist groups supported by the Islamic Republic, and to, in fact, bear pressure both on the regime itself and their cronies around the world. Finally, ADL has also just began a study that will be due out in months ahead on Iran's current state textbooks, which incite hatred toward Jews, Israel, Baha'i, and the US. So keep an eye out for that, which we think will be crucial for European and other governments to take notice of and raise an important and urgent human rights issues. I just want to end by saying that the Jewish citizens of Iran are held daily responsible not only for Israeli policies, but also live essentially between rock and a hard place, where at any moment they can be labeled Zionist spies. And as we've seen historically, the case has been where Jews are periodically and systematically put in jail, accused of being spies for the Israeli government. And so the lives of the Jews of Iran, it is very precarious, despite the fact that they're considered an officially recognized minority. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nazarian. So just before we move on to the final speaker of the day, I wanted to take a quick moment to make mention of the hashtag IRF Ministerial and also the IOPHR Press handle on Twitter. I think one of my colleagues is going to share here. Yeah, so obviously one of the key themes of the conversation today is about sharing some of these fantastic statistics and data that people are mentioning. So please, use that platform, use Twitter, use the hashtag, and we'd appreciate if you could follow us. Okay, so moving on to the final speaker, and then we will be swiftly moving into the Q&A. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Farhad Sabetan. Dr. Sabetan has taught economics at California State University, East Bay for the past 7 years and has been a research economist in the private and public sectors for more than 15 years. He's currently a spokesperson for the Baha'i International Community, United Nations, and has been involved in the human rights field in the past 13 years. He's given many interviews about the situation of the Baha'is in Iran on a variety of different news outlets. He's obtained his Doctor of Philosophy and Economics from the University of California. Dr. Sabetan, over to you.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Baha'i International Community, allow me to extend my appreciation to IOPHR for organizing this important event and my esteemed colleagues here who are defending human rights at a time when religious freedom is forcefully constrained in Iran and various religious groups continue to face persecution solely because of their religious beliefs. In this month alone, according to Harana website, 74 individuals in various cities, including Tabriz, Marivan, Sanandaj, and Bukhan, have been arrested because of their religious affiliations. 26 Baha'is, a new converted Iranian to Christianity, Mr. Ibrahim Firuzi, and a Sunni Muslim, Mr. Abdullah Malazi, They've all been summoned to respective courts in their cities. Illegal arrests, interrogations, imprisonment, especially under the significant spread of COVID-19, are continuing without any consideration for the health and well-being of prisoners, while religious minorities continue to be deprived of their basic human rights. For example, so far this year, the number of Baha'is who have been denied access to higher education has increased to 21. Properties belonging to individual Baha'is and Baha'i institutions in Iran have been routinely and illegally confiscated. The latest case is that of the Baha'is of the village of Ivel in northern Iran in Mazandaran, where despite repeated visits to the appropriate authorities and without a chance for the lawyers to see the files in order to prepare a statement of defense and produce documents and disclosure, Branch 8 of the Court of Appeals of Mazandaran held an extraordinary session on 13 October 2020 and ruled against the legitimacy of the ownership of 27 of the Baha'is in the village of Ivel. It endorsed to sell the farmland and lands owned by Baha'is. There are, of course, many more cases of various forms of persecution of Baha'is, as they are virtually deprived of all citizenship and human rights in that country, including the right to be buried with dignity, as many of their cemeteries have been severely desecrated. Despite all this, however, during the adoption of the Resolution on Human Rights Situation in Iran at UN 3C and UNGA 75, Iran's representative indicated that Iranians enjoy equal rights, and he specifically mentioned the freedom of religious minorities. It would be hard to imagine that Iranian authorities are unaware of the atrocities against religious minorities in that country, because at least for the Baha'is, official court documents leave absolutely no doubt that these Baha'is are sentenced and imprisoned solely because of their religious beliefs or practice. The website Archives of Baha'i Persecution in Iran, which is a URL, iranbahaipersecution.bic.org, presents literally thousands of official documents attesting to this fact. This deplorable situation can only be attributed to the official attitude of the Iranian government toward Baha'is, as clearly demonstrated in an official document of Iran's Supreme Cultural Council memorandum, discovered in 1991, in which it is stated, quote, "The governments dealing with them," meaning Baha'is, "must be in such a way that their progress and development are blocked, and that," quote again, "they must be expelled from universities, either in the admission process or during the course of their studies, once it becomes known that they are Baha'is." The Iranian constitution does not recognize the Baha'i faith as a legitimate religion. Therefore, Iranian officials consider Baha'is as unprotected infidels and apostates, which according to Islamic Sharia has the highest level of punishment. More than 200 Baha'is have been executed since the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, too numerous to identify individually, solely because of their belief in the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i international community ardently asks the international community to urge the authorities in Iranian government to transform their attitude towards the Baha'is in Iran and to conform to the human rights norms and standards to which they are a signatory. Thank you so much for your care and attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sabatan. Okay, so with that, we would like to just move on to a few questions which were submitted from our attendees today. So I'm now going to open the floor to all the guest panelists tonight. The first question that's been submitted was, given the systematic religious persecution in Iran as a means of controlling the diverse set of beliefs that exist there, what do the panel think is the best way to stop this systematic oppression? If you'd like to jump in, please feel free to unmute yourself.
If I may, I'll start from the grassroots. I think Iranian government, the reason they're so hard on cracking down on civil liberties and people's access to social media is the realization that people's attitudes shift when they have the whole truth. They have been maintaining a monopoly on how people think towards other people with other beliefs. And I think we constantly, as advocates, as members of religious minorities, speak to the governments, which is good. But at the same time, I think we need to speak to the general population, and those misconceptions that the Iranian government is investing millions on creating, we have to unravel that and then allow people to see for themselves. I mean, one of my brightest moments in the last few years was when a former member of the parliament and daughter to a very influential Mr. Rafsanjani, when she was imprisoned along with some Baha'is, and just sitting with them and socializing with them, realized how naive those perceptions were that she was educated with in the family, in the society. And she went against the government guidelines, even family guidelines, to go and greet them when they were on a leave. And that's the attitude that we need to help harbor and encourage. So that's, I think, would be a starting point, but I'm sure the other panelists could contribute to this too.
Anybody else would like to add to those very valid points?
If I may, just very briefly, you know, I think as long as the Islamic Republic rules over Iran, there won't be any freedom for religious minorities. Human rights will not be protected. And I think from now on, the state of repression in Iran is going to become much, much worse. And I really do believe that the vast majority of Iranians do not want the theocracy which rules over Iran. And I think it's incumbent upon all foreign governments and citizens to keep up the pressure against the Islamic Republic. I have zero hope that this regime will reform itself. And I do really believe that Iranian society is ready for a secular and democratic government. And I do really believe that the vast majority of Iranians really don't care what other religions their fellow citizens practice. I think society has become more tolerant in Iran, while the regime has become much more intolerant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Given Europe's continued trade relations with the Iranian regime, despite its abhorrent human rights record, what do the panel think is the best way to address this situation so that the European lifeline for the regime becomes subject to the Iranian regime's human rights record? Please go ahead, Mr. Sabaton.
Well, since this is a topic that relates to my field of study, trade, and I'm not limiting it to the European countries, but also pretty much all partners who are trading with Iran. I think it is absolutely imperative for the international community to not sacrifice or ignore human rights norms and standards for the sake of trade. It is very much should be the policy of the international community to ensure that their relationship with the Iranian government is in fact very closely tied to observing human rights. And it is my understanding that the Iranian government does care about the international opinion. And therefore, the international community should basically make sure that the human rights is on top of the agenda in any form of a relationship with Iran, and of course, is not sacrificed.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add to this question?
Thank you for the opportunity. As it was mentioned by other panelists, the European countries have never taken the issue of human rights serious compared to their economic gains and dealings with the Islamic Republic. And unfortunately, the global media has also ignored this issue and the issue of human rights so that they can challenge the authorities in Iran. And as long as there is a regime or a rule based on theocracy and religious beliefs, Iran would not be free, regardless of who is in charge. We need a secular democratic regime in Iran, which is based on the principles of human rights and also educating and informing people of Iran. And unfortunately, the regime in Iran over the past 42 years has stigmatized different groups, different minority groups, Baha'is, Christians, converts to Christianity, Sufis, etc. And through these measures, they have instilled animosity among different populations and different groups in Iran, which needs to be eradicated based on education. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Merci. Thank you so much. So our third and final question. Does the panel think it's a good idea for religious minorities in Iran to come together and have a collective voice that speaks against the regime, as often the only times these groups come together is to speak at events such as this one? When it comes to dealing with religious oppression issues, a collective voice may have more impact in terms of dealing with important international organizations such as the EU and the UN.
Perhaps I'll take that one. Given that ADL has a long history of really doing coalition work in the US, we have a lot of experience with that. Looking into the actual minority groups within Iran, that is more challenging as this regime does a good job of also playing groups against one another. What I'd like to suggest is the coalition work that diaspora communities can do together outside Iran. And the coming together of not only panels like this, but our ADL task force that I referenced, that is critical. It is critical for our, all the religious minority communities in the diaspora to speak with one voice, to bear pressure not only on the US government as we head into the Biden administration with the concerns that Ali Reza raised about that pressure being lifted off to the regime, but as well in Europe and other countries such as South Korea, Japan, major trading partners. So if we as diaspora communities join hands together, that's where the impact could really be had. I think within Iran, it's more difficult, but definitely, certainly outside, that's a place where we can come together, speak with one voice about the atrocities being committed by the Islamic Republic onto its own citizens on a daily basis. And that we hold our own governments in the US and in Europe responsible for bearing pressure on the regime and not always putting their economic interest ahead of human rights issues.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much, Dr. Nazarian. So we've reached the time. I would like to now quickly go back through each of our wonderful panelists. And if you could keep it to just 1 minute, just your wrap up or conclusion or any closing words you'd like to say from today. So we will start with Mr. Ali Reza Nader.
I don't have much to say. I just really do believe that the international community should pressure the Islamic Republic in every way possible. That's really the only way they will see a respect for human rights and religious minorities in Iran is for this regime to go away permanently. And that will be done by the Iranian people through peaceful means. But I think international pressure is very important and we shouldn't forget human rights when it comes to Iran.
Thank you so much. Moving on, Mr. Ebrahim Ahrari, if you could give us just your brief conclusion from the talk today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm grateful and I hope that this unity and conferences like this grows and continues so that soon in a free Iran, we can all live side by side in harmony and unity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And moving on, Mr. Mansour Borji.
I think the right to religious freedom, as very correctly defined in the preamble of the Declaration of the International Declaration of Human Rights, is a fundamental right, not just a matter of concern for the religious minorities. It is for all people of all faith, whether majority or minority. And that's something that we need to adopt a language that everybody would understand. If we're here talking about the rights of the Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, it's a right of every Iranian to choose what they believe or not to believe at all. And that's something that we can collectively try and focus our efforts towards.
Thank you. Very important point. So Dr. Afshin Sajidi, if you'd like to share your closing remarks with us.
Yes, just I would like to attract your attention that the problem of the issue of minorities in Iran cannot be approached without regarding to other problems. I mean that through a systemic approach, we have to see that, or we can see that this is a bigger problem that should be approached and should be solved. And I think that the easiest and cheapest solution for this problem is dedicating full support of human rights activities inside of Iran, that they can change, because they are, because we know that, and we have to confess that the regime of Iran has made a new identity for the Iranian population, for the Iranian people, and they think on the other way than we think here. So we have two positive point. One of them is social media and connecting and communication, the direct communication with the population of Iran, and the second is the human rights activities. But outside the country, as the Mrs. Nazarian mentioned very, very correctly, we have to join our hands. And then my concrete suggestion is that we made an demand or ask to the European Union to make diplomatic sanctions, full diplomatic sanctions for the Iranian embassies. And I'm sure that because according to my information, that they use the diplomatic channels for survival. So if it can be touched and if it can be that if we can use these sanctions for diplomatic means also, I am sure that the behavior of Iran will be changed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sajidi. And moving on to Dr. Sharon Nazarian.
Perhaps to take a more regional view, as the changing sands of the Middle East are being impacted by the recent normalization accord, the Abraham Accord between Israel and UAE and Bahrain, Iran and this regime will continue to feel more and more hopefully isolated and in a corner. I think it's incumbent on all of us to, both in our positions as human rights organizations, but also as analysts of geostrategic affairs, to continue to look for alliances, even where we've thought in the past were not possible. The regime is a bad actor towards its own citizens, towards its own religious minorities, towards its neighbors, and literally globally. Iran is a threat, is a global threat. So I think for all of us to continue to do the important work we're doing, but also make sure that we're understanding that we need to reach across past taboos and work together to isolate this regime as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful message. And finally, Dr. Sabatan.
Thank you very much. I think that those colleagues of mine who are here and for everyone else who cares about human rights, I think we all have a very important job to do. And that is to really create and promote a culture of understanding human rights. Because in the final analysis, we are all humans. And unless this idea of the oneness and unification of all human beings as they are all humans, unless this culture is permeated and developed as a vision, as a unified vision for governments, non-governmental organizations, civil society, I'm not sure if we can solve any problem. I think it starts with here, and I'm so delighted to see that we are all working toward that unified vision, except that we have a major work to do to bring others on board on this unified vision as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of the fantastic panelists that we've heard from today. You can see on the screen now very quickly, I will just wrap up by mentioning we have another event tomorrow, equally as important, legalization of child marriage and the oppression of women under Iran's ruling regime in the last 4 decades. If you can join, please do so. The link is at the bottom there, IRF for Women Children event. And finally, I'm delighted to announce that we will also be holding an event on the 10th of December, which I'm sure you all know is International Human Rights Day, which is called From Conflict to Unity, Learning from the Beacons of the Past. And we hope this will be an inspiring event to help inspire us all to take these continued actions that we need to. So thank you again. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you for all of our many participants that have stayed with us for the last hour and a half. I hope it's been informative, and we really look forward to continuing this conversation. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.